When fear and terror are the main components of any government, it isn't difficult to spot a conclave of power-drunk politicians coveting power for themselves. This has played out over and over again in movies and the real world, with the masses being the victims of this power play. However, the case is quite different in El Salvador. Nayib Bukele, a marketing executive turned president, is renowned for his audaciously controversial yet successful policies in rescuing the Salvadoran economy from the clutches of poverty. Bukele, who dubbed himself the world's coolest dictator in response to global criticism, has become an overnight sensation, particularly in El Salvador, where he enjoys an approval rating of nearly 90%. This is how El Salvador's millennial dictator is shaping the future of its economy. For nearly a century, El Salvador has known violence and bloodbaths, as decade after decade, thousands of Salvadorans have lost families, friends, and countrymen to extreme brutality. Less than a decade ago, El Salvador was dubbed the homicide capital of the world, with a murder rate 90 times greater than the UK. In August 2015, a bloodbath between the country's top rival gangs, MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang, resulted in more than 30 deaths within 24 hours. It was the deadliest the country had witnessed in over 2 decades. In response, the Salvadoran government declared war on gang-related activities in the country, which came after several failed attempts at brokering a truce with the gangs. The crackdown, however, had little effect on the gangs, whose membership combined was over 50,000, possibly close to 100,000. Gang activities in the country had begun in the aftermath of the Salvadoran Civil War. Thousands migrated to the United States to avoid the chaos, settling down in California. Many of these refugees formed local gangs to protect themselves from racism and exploitation. However, they delved into criminal activities, which hastened their arrest and mass deportation in the mid-90s. Returning to El Salvador, the gangs grew in number and have perpetrated mayhem since then. A 2016 study revealed the annual cost of gang violence in El Salvador to be worth 16% of its GDP, quite costly for a country of 6.5 million people. In March 2022, the gangs struck again, setting a new record of carnage. 62 deaths within 24 hours. Sources say the killings were inspired by another failed truce between the gangs and the government. This time around, the response from the Bukele government caught both gang leaders and members by surprise. The government declared régimen de excepción, or state of emergency, and began Operation Guerra contra las Pandillas, war against the gangs. Orders from President Bukele saw thousands of civil police and military invading several municipalities in pursuit of gang members. Since the state of emergency declaration, constitutional rights have been suspended and over 75,000 citizens have been arrested for their connection with the country's vicious gangs. This large number of detainees accounts for nearly 2% of the adult population, and since the arrests, the gangs have gone into hiding and the streets of rural El Salvador are the safest they have ever been. For this, President Bukele is basking in the praises of his countrymen, who for the longest of time have waited for the gangs to be dealt with an iron fist. However, there is a controversial twist to Bukele's gang crackdown. His government has been accused of human rights violations and hundreds of arrests made on false charges. President Bukele himself has admitted that 1% of the arrests would have been wrong, but he claims the lower security levels have helped reverse the mass migration caused by gang violence. Moreover, with the gangs gone, businesses thrived better as more citizens expunged their fears and worries and opened new business outlets. Throughout its history, El Salvador has only known violence, dating back to the 1900s, when the entire country quaked in the face of a devastating massacre and a civil war. Salvadoran historian Héctor Lindo Fuentes once wrote that to be Salvadoran means knowing that something tremendous happened in late January 1932. This was a period of untold hardship for thousands of Salvadoran peasants who toiled day and night for the country's oligarchy. These powerful landowners controlled more than 50% of arable land and cooperated with the country's right-wing military to keep the peasants under an iron fist. Fed up with the high level of inequality, the farmers staged an uprising in 1932, led by Salvadoran labor leader Agustin Farabundo Marti under the umbrella of the Central American Socialist Party. They had one request: an equal share in the country's wealth and resources. However, the government reprised their agitation by ordering la matanza, which means the slaughter. Farabundo Marti and his fellow demonstrators were violently suppressed and massacred, with death tolls reaching 30,000. This began a long era of bloodshed, violence, and oppression in El Salvador. For the next 5 to 6 decades, the country became the playing field for military dictatorships, particularly the 60s and 70s. Decades of oppression climaxed when Arturo Armando Molina of the National Conciliation Party won the Salvadoran presidential election in 1972. Molina's victory was widely opposed by right and leftist groups in the country. Guerrilla forces soon sprung up and carried out small-scale operations across El Salvador. The rocketing prices of food and dwindling agricultural output, coupled with the 1973 oil crisis, shattered Molina's government and plunged El Salvador into greater depths of poverty. In 1977, General Carlos Humberto Romero took over from Arturo Molina. Romero's ascent to power was not just a fraudulent ascent to power. He had little regard for the rule of law or the lives of the people he governed. His inauguration was met with protests in downtown San Salvador. Rather than pacification, the demonstrators were shot point-blank by security forces who arrived on scene. Hundreds lost their lives in the massacre. Devastating as it was, the killings were nothing compared to the carnage that would shake the entire country. A series of distasteful events from the mid-70s to the early 80s instigated the Salvadoran Civil War. These harrowing events began with the establishment of paramilitary death squads, through whose nefarious activities, hundreds of lives were brutally cut short. Aside from the death squads, the government rained hell on any citizen who dared to oppose its policies. Students, union leaders, activists, teachers, and even priests were prime targets in the government's onslaught. With El Salvador on the verge of insurrection, the revolutionary government junta staged a coup and unseated General Romero. The junta was supported by the United States, no secrecy in that. The Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan governments would also equip the Salvadoran military with tactical training, aid, and military advisors to help combat their counterinsurgency problem. The US turned a blind eye to several human rights violations done by the Salvadoran military before and during the Civil War. In one such case, Human Rights Watch noted that US Embassy officials collaborated with the death squad abduction of 2 law students in January 1980, following their anti-government demonstration. Next, the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero in March 1980, and the murder of 4 Jesuit priests set the war in motion. The Archbishop had actively spoken against the right-wing government and warned against continued US support. This, of course, earned him a place on the government's blacklist. His death was widely criticized and received massive attention. However, this did nothing to curtail the systematic killings. The Salvadoran military, in pursuit of left-wing guerrillas, committed atrocities against their own countrymen. Thousands of powerless civilians who found themselves amid the violence were mindlessly slaughtered. Military operations like draining the sea, Scorched Earth, and the El Mozote massacre were instances of the military's gross violations of human rights. The United States was often in headlines concerning its involvement in the conflict, but the US government diverted attention from itself by slandering the reputation of journalists and reporters who dared to uncover the truth. The Civil War lasted 12 years, with the death toll almost tripling that of the 1932 massacre. The left-wing guerrilla force, or FMNL, Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, and the Salvadoran government signed the Chapultepec Peace Accords in January 1992 via the United Nations, which ended the war and provided amnesty for the guerrilla forces. After that, the FMNL transitioned into a political party. Peace after 75,000 deaths. This was the price El Salvador had to pay. The war left the economy in shambles. A series of land reforms to combat problems of inequality was rejected by the richest 10% of the population. Even after the peace accords, violence still permeated the atmosphere. Over half of the population lived in extreme poverty, and a huge disparity in access to basic needs existed between the rural and urban zones of the country. For instance, only 16% of rural households had access to drinking water. Even at that, 35% of government-distributed water wasn't appropriate for human consumption. Back in 1996, the Salvadoran government boasted that in El Salvador, a strong market economy has favored macroeconomic stability, economic growth, and competitiveness. In addition, El Salvador had one of the most dynamic and stable markets in the hemisphere. While these claims were born out of a successful meeting with the World Bank, the reality was that this much-acclaimed growth had little effect on the population. Purchasing power had drastically deteriorated, and poverty, especially against women, surged rapidly. A larger part of the population was trapped in the vicious cycle of job insecurity, criminal violence, and poverty. 2001 was a particularly difficult year for El Salvador. Considering the government's huge decision to dollarize the economy, one would expect, if at all, a slight growth and positive outcome in the economy. But the trend towards indebtedness, corruption, global economic recession, the loss of international reserves, and increased unemployment and poverty were harsh realities that did not equate to the 2% growth recorded by the government. But to say the Salvadoran economy made no progress at all would be an understatement. Several finance organizations, internationally and within Latin America, saw El Salvador as one of the most dynamic and active economies in the hemisphere. The country was shortlisted among the Latin American tigers, although verbally. This perceived progress, however, had little to do with the implementation of government policies, according to a Social Watch report. Between 1990 and 1996, there was increased foreign investment in the maquiladora sector, which made it the largest growth sector in the Salvadoran economy. By 1996, the sector accounted for 42.76% of Salvadoran exports. Women were major beneficiaries in this sector as they made up 78% of the workforce, generating 31% of the total value of Salvadoran exports. Remittances were also an important factor in this growth. Decades of systematic violence before and during the Civil War inspired a massive migration of around 1 million Salvadorans, many of whom sent money to their families in El Salvador. This has improved the living conditions of about 15% of Salvadoran families. In 1995, remittances amounted to a little over $1 million and represented 12.4% of the country's GDP. Since then, these figures have grown rapidly. When President Bukele took over in 2019, he had so much to say about the country's violent past and its corrupt politicians, among whom are 3 of his predecessors who are on trial for corruption. The fact that Bukele did not campaign under the country's 2 major political parties made the masses see him as their savior, their reformer, God's gift to the people. To end this, he calls himself the post-war generation, the generation with new ideas. At 37, Nayib Bukele became the youngest Central American president, famous for his active social media pages, his casual outfits, and a pool of controversial plans and policies. More recently, President Bukele has unveiled another of his controversial plans. This time, he hopes to build a Bitcoin city in El Salvador, making the country the first in the entire world to attempt a crypto-powered adventure. This, of course, came with heavy criticism within and outside El Salvador. After the 2021 announcement at the Latin Bitcoin conference, Bukele has made Bitcoin legal tender, another first-in-the-world achievement, with some parts of the country sporting Bitcoin ATMs. Bukele plans to build his oceanside Bitcoin city at the base of a volcano, whose geothermal energy will power Bitcoin mining and cater to the needs of the city. Another interesting fact is that the city features 0% income tax, 0% capital gains tax, 0% property tax, and 0% payroll tax. These, plus the issuance of volcano bonds worth $1 billion, are part of Bukele's plan plans to woo his over 2,000 Bitcoin investors. The Chivo wallet, an app launched by the Bukele government, has a welcome bonus of $30 worth of Bitcoins to encourage mass participation. However, since President Bukele's Bitcoin frenzy, the price of the King crypto has dropped by 50%, confirming the fears and uncertainty in the hearts of his critics and the international community. In response to concerns that El Salvador might eventually default on loans, Bukele has requested $1.3 billion from the IMF to improve state finances. But experts say this is just another plan for the government to finance its populist programs. The United States, the European Union, and the Organization of American States have criticized Bukele's most audacious acts, intimidating members of the Congress with military power, sacking 6 Supreme Court judges, and replacing them with his loyalists. Bukele has certainly not played his politics fair and square, but if his near 90% rating is something to go by, he has indeed won the hearts of millions of Salvadorans. His famous gang crackdown has been approved and imitated by neighboring countries like Guatemala and Honduras, whose government has declared a state of emergency to fight crime. Bukele has also earned a pass from a few US Republicans. Aside from his war on criminal gang activities, Bukele's government has been celebrated for its pool of public infrastructure projects, low gas prices, increased minimum wage, and its handling of the global pandemic. The Salvadoran economy experienced a 10.3% post-pandemic GDP growth in 2021. According to official data from the World Bank, El Salvador's GDP in 2022 was worth $32.49 billion, a 2.6% increase from 2021, and a GDP per capita of $4,276. Bukele has announced his intentions to run for a second term in 2024, despite a constitutional ban on second terms. The question is, will Salvadorans ignore this ban, overlook his dictatorial tendencies, and give him another chance?